here. Welcome to Micro Budget Film Lab. Sorry I've been a little bit absent the last week and a half. I got totally bogged down with some development work, and then I got kind of sick and had to self-quarantine away from everybody and everything in this space here, which is an okay space for my office. It's a nice big space for my office, actually. But to live in it for a week was a bit intense, and never leaving to go outside. So I'm going back outside. I've got a little bit of a gravelly voice still, but other than that, I'm doing pretty good, and nothing is transmittable over video that I'm aware of anyway, other than, I guess, computer viruses maybe. So I wanted to come back on some of this, see how you're doing. I wanted to hear back from you and talk a little bit about my development stuff, because it relates actually to the Into the Story character sheet that I uploaded, the Excel spreadsheet that I uploaded to the Facebook One Room Masterpiece page that you can download there, as well as the example that's on there that I uploaded that you can download, and but share some of my thoughts from the development work I did that actually related to that, talk a little bit about the process I went through, and then talk about another little kind of summary sheet that you can do to begin to kind of summarize your work that you're doing. And this is sort of a prelude to the more concrete story development work that you want to do next on your scripts in using the hero's journey. And I'll upload that sheet that I use, and the beat sheet, which is kind of modeled on the Save the Cat beat sheet, which I'll also upload, and I'll go through both of those and how you can use them, and use them differently from each other, because they serve different purposes, I think, but both can be useful. And I use them in this project that I've been working on in my development job, specifically a potential rewrite of another script that came in based on a book that there's interest in, but there needed a lot of reworking on. And so I was doing the kind of base preparatory work for that. And so the first thing I did before I went to this worksheet, the 7+1 worksheet, and before I did the beat sheet and the hero's journey, the Joseph Campbell hero's journey sort of beat sheet as well, that I used both of those. I did that the character thing, the 7 steps of story from Into the Story by John Truby, that I spoke about at length in the last video that I did for you guys. And what was interesting about that, and is always a useful reminder whenever I go through a development process, is how useful it is to have somebody to bounce this stuff off of, because that gave me an incredibly detailed picture of my characters and the world that they lived in. But everything is provisional when you're working on the script phase, and you're going to change things often substantially as you test them. You create a model and then you test it and you see what works. And it's really important to remember that, because each step of the process is like that. And so I did that detailed work and talked about, went through each of the characters. And then some of the characters, once I had a conversation with my head of development, changed completely. The main thrust remained the same in terms of the journey of the central character, but the secondary character, I was trying to bring all the characters who are in some sort of conflict with each other in alignment with the theme. You remember I talked about the thematic statement and how important it was. In this case, the theme we're exploring is virtue is its own reward, that kind of thing, or you should do good things. It's even more important to do good things when nobody's looking than it is when people are looking. Exploring that kind of thing. It's for a kid's story. And so I wanted each of the characters in some way to explore, to trace the arc of that thematic statement in order to reinforce and try to negate that statement. It's kind of like a scientific experiment in many ways, telling a story. You are coming up with a hypothesis, and then you're trying to disprove that hypothesis by throwing everything you can at the character, by exploring it from different points of view and so on, to see if that hypothesis, that thematic statement, holds up to water. And you're doing it differently than science, which is about, in a sense, logic and mathematics and the various ways that you test hypotheses. Instead, you're using images and conflicts, scenes, to test the hypothesis that you're doing. So it's a kind of more emotionally based, though there is a logic to it. So when I tested the the character sheet and the 7 steps of story sheet with my head of development, I discovered that some things were wanting and things weren't needed to be reworked, and I made lots of radical changes to that. So just keep that in mind. That is, try not to get frustrated with that, because it's an incredibly rich, useful process. Think of it as, enjoy the process of getting there. So now, once I had that done, before I go to the doing beat sheets, I try to kind of summarize the work that I do on this other thing called this 7+1 worksheet that I kind of created myself for what I thought were the key elements that should be summarized. The first one was to restate for myself what the central conflict is. Which of the 4 main types of conflict is it? Is it human versus human, human versus themselves, human versus society, human versus environment/God? How do I summarize what the conflict is? This person wants X. This person wants to be, what is the interior conflict? What is the exterior conflict? This person wants money, is broke, and has an alcohol problem, or is unemployed, or is obsessive compulsive, or whatever their defect is that they have in the world, or being in the world, and then also what is what is their main goal. And they always have those 2 things, and they are, in some ways, the external struggle is usually an avatar, or should be an avatar, of the internal struggle, which is ultimately rooted in the thematic conflict. The second element of the 7+1 is, and I'm going to upload this worksheet. So the second element is, how is this story relatable? And what I'm trying to get at here is, what is universal about your story? Because things happen all the time to us that are specific and personal and singular, and don't have general relatability, the general significance of what has happened to us as people, the struggles that we go through, is difficult to generalize to everybody as a whole. So you need to find, what is it about the conflict that your person faces that is relatable to people as a whole, and think about it. And now some of that is if you have your thematic statement, but this can also help you develop the thematic statement, the thematic argument that you're going to make, finding the thing that all people go through. So this person, loses their job, or this person wants to find the treasure. Think of something that's unusual from most of our everyday experience, traveling on a spaceship, or climbing to the top of Mount Everest, or rescuing your kidnapped daughter in the case of Taken. Most people don't go through that, and so it's very singular. And in some ways, in and of itself, it would be boring to watch, as exciting as rescuing somebody is, it would be boring to watch it just from the point of view of, their specific experiences. A writer always is trying to find the way that people who had never experienced that would be able to connect with it emotionally. So obviously, losing your daughter has an emotional impact in terms of people have children, people who have family members, the thought of losing them, the anxiety that we all feel when we're parents about the possibility of our children being hurt in some way. Think of the ways that your strange, crazy story is relatable to people. And I don't mean relatable in the way that often film executives and people in the business, on the business side, think of relatable. They think of relatable as being sort of directly connected to the common experience of what they consider the major market demographic that they're targeting. So, they mow their lawn, they like to drink beer, they watch football on Sundays, that sort of white male, mid-30s to 50 sort of demographic as the kind of universal character. Don't think of it in those terms. Think of it in the broader sense of what we all experience in terms of anxiety. And if you're telling a story about, say, minority oppression, the Rohingyas in Myanmar, or of African Americans in the United States facing police harassment, which is not something that maybe white people or people who are not African American would immediately experience. What is the ways that you can connect with them to make them identify with the struggle of the main character? What are the ways that you can make them identify with the struggle of this Rohingya, this Muslim in a country where they're being oppressed by the Buddhist majority. Think about those kinds of things, and that's really important, actually. So I've spent a little bit of time on there. What are the stakes involved? And keeping those stakes primal, thinking about it. They will lose their life. That's a primal stake. They won't get rich is not a primal stake. But they will not find love is a primal stake. Petty material things, even though it's a large number, like $1 billion, in and of itself is not what I would consider a primal stake, because people, they know money comes and goes, and it's not really the thing, even if they think it in their head, that's the thing that they want. Emotionally, that's not really what they want. Money is, again, an avatar. It's a fetish for some other thing. People think it has the power to deliver to them what they want. Saying beauty. Why do you want to be beautiful? Well, what is beauty anyway? Beauty's, it's transient. Where by the time you're in your 40s, you're no longer beautiful, probably in the sense that we tend to think of. The notion of beauty itself has changed radically over the decades and centuries. Short hair, long hair, skinny, heavier, taller, shorter, larger breasts, smaller breasts, muscular, non-muscular. There's all kinds of ways that has changed. So beauty itself is about kind of being loved, being popular, having friends, being important, being valued. So think about the primal stakes that are involved for your protagonist and your antagonist, because the antagonist is in some ways more important than the protagonist. What is the jeopardy? And I haven't talked about this before. Jeopardy means that your character must end up in some way, or they should anyway. Isn't always the case, but usually they should end up either getting the prize, winning the game, winning the whatever it is they want to win, or they should be worse off than they were at the beginning. It shouldn't just be back to status quo ante, the way things were. Oh well, they were back slumbering or whatever. They should be worse. Now they're addicted to drugs. Now they've lost their house. Now they're completely alone and isolated. Now their daughter is dead and they're in jail. Whatever it happens to be, think of the jeopardy that's going to leave them worse off at the end, and note it down, because that increases the power of the stakes that you're putting in for those people. What are some of the obstacles they face to realizing their goal, and how do they become more difficult over time? We're thinking about rising action here. Some of those you've probably already included in the Truby character spreadsheet that I gave you, that even though it's been a while since I got back to you, been about a week and a half since I sent you anything, I guess, that probably has taken you a week and a half. If you did it properly and you're writing kind of a lot of notes in all those Excel cells, you are bogged down with doing that. But within that, and if you filled it out in detail, within that you will see that to explain some of the character elements and so on of the story, those 7 story elements, you are probably noting some scene ideas, some obstacles that they're facing. Now, this is the place to take those and to begin to kind of bring them together from the different characters. You've got the different characters, and you're going to start to summarize them. You're going to start to order them in a really loose way. Don't get too uptight, but just start to think about, them, losing their job is a kind of more serious obstacle they face than it was them getting the dental bill in the first place that they couldn't pay for, and then they were trying to get the money for that by going to the tracks, and then they lost a job, and so on. So start to order them in some kind of logical, arcing fashion as just the beginning of that process, beginning to start to congeal elements of your story in place that's going to pay off later in terms of making the beat sheet more easy. And it doesn't mean you have to have all of it, but you want to know kind of the beginning, you want to know the end, and something in the middle, so that you don't have second act problems. What is the arc of the central character, and how do they change? Again, you've done a variation on this in the Truby spreadsheet that I gave you. Do it here, summarize it here, state it again, how they change, and how it relates specifically in terms of the thesis that's being explored, which you want to write down here. What are you theorizing about the world, and how to get the good life in the world? So those are 2 things there. And finally, the +1 is what makes your story fresh and unique. And this is one of those intangibles that's out there. People will say to you, make it the same but different. When you talk to people who work in the industry who are looking for content or whatever. But it's useful in the sense of you want to make things, Brecht, the playwright, the German playwright from early part of the 20th century, talked about the V effect, I believe it is, the alienation effect. I think V is for the German word for alienation. But you want to kind of alienate people from the material. That is, you want your material to be universal, but you don't want it to look exactly like their lives, because people are going for escape. They don't want to just see their lives. They know their lives. They live their lives. And that's why I said in a previous video, during the Iraq War movies didn't do that well because people could turn on the news and see the drama with higher stakes because they were real on an ongoing basis. So you need to find a way to make your story, both distant from the person, because distance allows literally a critical distance. People can think about what they're seeing, lose themselves in it a bit without thinking, it bringing up for them the anxieties that they experience over the day. And you also want it to be fresh and unique in the sense that if it's just the same old thing that they've seen last week, and it's hard to come up with new stuff, every story has been told before and there's nothing new under the sun and all that. But there are ways of telling stories that feels different than what they saw last week. And so think about the kinds of, what elements of your story are different from what you've seen out there in terms of movies. I'm working on, in fact, I think I uploaded it though, Waterbirth, a character sheet that I did with using the Truby stuff for this series of novels that I want to work on. That'll be my own, because I do ghost writing of novels, and I wanted to write one of my own, and I had this idea for this character that's in there, and kind of about her sort of becoming a god. And I watched completely by accident while I was in quarantine. I watched Lucy, which was by Luc Besson, which is sort of a fun movie. And it had a very similar kind of idea in some ways about this character, Lucy, who ingests this drug by accident. Well, it's sewn into her, and then the bag leaks, and this drug turns out to activate all the neurons in her brain, and she starts to use her entire brain all at once. And so she becomes kind of increasingly godlike in her abilities to control matter and her own body and all that. And I thought, oh my God, it's the same story. I did all this freaking work on this character sheet and I'm telling the same story. And so I had to kind of take a step back and think about, well, how is my story different? Because my story is not an action movie or an action thriller in the same way. It's a different kind of character. Their arc is different. What they need to learn about themselves in terms of the theme being explored, it's very different. So even though there were some crossover elements, there was enough different that I felt like after I panicked for 2 days and retreated into watching woodworking videos while I was here in quarantine. So maybe I'm going to do some videos on how to make a stool. But so I had to it forced me to think about what was unique and fresh about that story. And you need to do the same thing about yours, because you're probably going to find corollaries. The people don't realize how unoriginal they are. And I include myself in this. I include everybody in this until they're kind of faced with it in some sort of way. A number of years ago, I was reading all these scripts. I was doing coverage and development on this MOW series, thematically organized series of MOWs, movies of the week for made for TV movies that were thrillers. And so I read hundreds of these scripts, and a lot of them were very similar. But there was these two scripts that I read very close to one another, coincidentally, and they were literally almost exactly the same. They had the same climax in a boat, and the boat did the same thing. It was so weird. Like it was the same concept. The lead character was a gambler and a thief, and it was a heist movie and this boat, and I was like, oh, that's so weird that these scripts are almost exactly the same, and it's the same arc and everything. And I looked up the writers. I thought they must live near each other, and they're like in the same writer circle, or they worked on the same things together, or whatever. And it turned out they didn't. They didn't know each other at all. One they lived half a world apart. One lived in LA and one lived in London, England. They never worked on the same projects together. It was highly unlikely that they ever knew each other, and yet they came up with the exact same thing. So it's just kind of, we live and we breathe the same kind of cultural phenomena, the same zeitgeist, the same concerns, climate change, the pandemic, the same sort of cultural milieus that exist, certain kinds of music, hip hop and R&B, and all these things that we don't even think about, that are just kind of things around us, and they affect how we think about story, pacing, tone, everything. And so we have to be really conscious and try to take a step outside in order to try to create something that's unique and different. And so that's your kind of plus one, is if you can find ways that set apart your story and make it unique. Think about some of the wonderful movies. I'm a big sci-fi fan, and that's what I watch. But some of the wonderful stories out there that have taken a different tact on it. Ex Machina is an example of that. It's a story it's a Frankenstein story, really, but it's done in a really interesting way that explores gender, that sets in a really quiet locale. Like the tone is different, the way it's shot is unique, so that it's not like a B-grade horror movie. It's this complex. It's explores the personality development of the Frankenstein monster and the personality of the Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein. It's a wonderful movie that's worth watching and thinking about how it's different from other takes on that kind of subgenre, the creation of the monster. Because there was that other one, Singularity, with who was it? Who starred in that? I want to say it was Robert Downey Jr., but I'm not sure that it was. But it was also a sci-fi about a guy who creates a computer machine, and then he becomes the monster himself. That kind of technology run amok thing. So it was a unique take on that. So think about some of those fresh movies that were surprising, and how yours is surprising also. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'll try to get something else to you this week if I can. Well, it's Thursday, so it'll probably be next week, actually. And the next thing I'll probably do is the Joseph Campbell Hero's Journey, and probably talk a bit about some specific character elements that are useful to keep in mind as you're working on your character and thinking about who they are and how to write them in a way that makes them stand out. So until the next time, I hope you're all being well and safe, and we'll talk soon. And leave your comments on the YouTube channel or on the Facebook page, and I look forward to your thoughts. And I'll upload the 7+1 worksheet. Bye for now.